Hello and welcome to my French Grand Prix review. Looking back, I should say, at the French Grand Prix at Paul Ricard, and not a track where you would associate with a lot of overtaking, but actually we did see some overtaking and plenty of drama from start to finish, and a top three of Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, and George Russell. So I guess we have to start with Red Bull as they came out on top, and yeah, it wasn't the most straightforward of weekends for Max. However, whilst he wasn't able to put the car on pole on Saturday, he was able to, even though put it on front row, put it on second. Um, and then really, I think for Max, I think it was a case just trying to manage the race really and let the race come to him. We are going to come on to talk about Charles and Leclerc and Ferrari, but whilst Charles did have his moment, it was Max that pounced, and really once Max was out in front, he never looked troubled, and yeah, I think Max Verstappen drove a controlled race, and as I say, he looked controlled, didn't really have that threat from behind, and no, a good win for Max Verstappen, and in the end, basically Max now has been able to extend his lead in drivers' championship. And so, yeah, not a bad weekend for Max at all. On the other half of the Red Bull garage, difficult weekend for Sergio Perez, and just wasn't quite able to get to the same levels as Max and have a strong weekend. I say that, and yet Sergio managed to finish fourth. But it could so easily been a Red Bull, two Red Bull drivers on the podium. But we'll come on to talk about George making it onto the podium. But yeah, as I say, Sergio not quite at his strongest this weekend. I guess the only consolation for Checo is the fact that he was able to close the gap between himself and Charles Leclerc in the drivers' standings. So he has been able to claw into the advantage that Charles had over him before the start of the weekend in France. But yeah, Checo will be hoping for better in Hungary. Could be a tough track for Red Bull, but we will wait and see whether that turns out to be the case. But from a Red Bull perspective, good win for Max Verstappen. Saw him extend his lead in the Drivers' Championship, and they will be heading to, he'll be heading to Hungary in good spirits. Come on, talk about Mercedes now. Mercedes, interesting with Mercedes, isn't it? They thought that they brought some upgrades to France, and thought that was going to make an impact in qualifying. Didn't quite work out the way that they would have liked. Although Lewis was able to qualify fourth, and then George was able to qualify sixth. So he would have been slightly disappointed, George, to have been out qualified by Lando Norris in the McLaren. And then George didn't quite get off to the best of starts. No, Fernando Alonso got by on the opening lap. So yeah, it wasn't the most straightforward of Saturdays for Mercedes anyway. But the race came to them, and Lewis, whilst he wasn't able to challenge Max as he would have liked, didn't have the pace to do that, he looked comfortable in second. There wasn't really a threat. There was that brief spell in the early stages of the races where Checo looked like he may have got by Lewis, but once Lewis was able to hold off that threat, really he looked quite comfortable in second, and there wasn't really a threat from behind. So yeah, a good race all round for Lewis. Look, of course, Mercedes want to be winning races, but when you consider the struggle that they have had this season, for them to have both their drivers on the podium, I think is a great result for the team. And then, Lewis, on race day, being able to get by or get past Sergio Perez on that opening lap, on the opening lap was absolutely vital to his race. So, and yeah, so good race from Lewis Hamilton and also George Russell as well. He's had one or two difficult races recently, but I thought George drove another fine race, and obviously we saw him make the most of. I don't know what happened with Sergio in terms of the notification that he got about the virtual safety car ending. But George was able to pounce, and quite an opportune move that George made, but he made it stick, and credit to him, and he was able to just about hold off Checo in the end to take that third place on the podium. So a lot of positives I think Mercedes can take from the weekend in France, and I think in Hungary they may potentially struggle. I don't think it's a track that will really suit their car. But we'll wait and see. You just never know what can happen in Hungary. So yeah, as I say, I'm not really expecting the Hungarian track to suit the Mercedes, but they'll still be heading to Hungary, no doubt, in fine spirits. One team who won't be in the best of moods going into Hungary, Ferrari, and it really was a case of what might have been for Ferrari in France, and it was looking also good on Saturday and in the early parts of the race on Sunday for Charles Leclerc. Did a great job in qualifying on Saturday to put the car on pole, and then really he was able to hold off the threat of Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc until he until he lost the rear, and openly said that was his mistake, and credit to him for owning up to it. But Charles also mentioned the fact that if he continues to make these mistakes, then it's going to cost him being in contention for the drivers' championship, and he's right to say that. So he needs to. And he doesn't need me to say, and he knows the fact that he can't afford to be keep doing these mistakes. But yeah, Charles, no, he knows what he has to do now, and there's still a long way to go this season, and it just takes a couple of DNFs for Max, and a couple of wins for Charles, and Charles is right back in it. So, and I think going to Hungary, I think Ferrari, you could argue, is it a race they need to win? Is it a must win? You could say yes. When you consider the fact that Max has now got a 60+ point lead in the Drivers' Championship, if Charles is serious about wanting to put a dent in Max's lead, then you could argue that Charles has got to win on Sunday in Hungary. So a big weekend in Hungary for Ferrari. As for Carlos Sainz, you know what? It would have been interesting to see, had he not had to been forced into taking those penalties, where would Carlos have ended up? And also the fact that if he didn't have to make that final pit stop, where would he have ended up? Could he have finished? Could he have finished second? Could he have challenged Lewis? Because it was looking good for him on the medium tires, and when they called him, he was probably the quick. I think at that point, I think he was quickest man on the track. I think. So, but I can kind of understand why Ferrari brought him, because being concerned about the tyre life, having been on the mediums for so long, and it could have got to a stage where Carlos would have been really struggling in the closing stage of the race. I can kind of understand why Ferrari brought him in. But at the same time, Carlos was going so well, he's driving well. Was it worth? Could he have stayed out? Then that was also a possibility. So yeah, so difficult one for Carlos. But I thought he drove well, pulled off some fine moves, particularly on Sergio Perez. I absolutely loved that move from Carlos Sainz, and yeah, I thought the way that he was able to fight back from the back of the grid, I thought he did a great job. So yeah, well, disappointing weekend for Ferrari in the end, after what promised so much for them. So the battle for fourth in the constructors between Alpine and McLaren. you just get the impression that it's going to go down to the wire, isn't it? So we saw Fernando Alonso finish in 6th and Esteban Ocon finish in 8th. So the first time he's finished in the points in France at his home Grand Prix. And it was really a weekend out of the two Alpine drivers anyway. It was a weekend where Fernando did dominate Esteban. But even so, good points for both drivers. And in the end of that French weekend, Alpine will go to Hungary with a 4-point lead over McLaren in the Constructors. So, yeah, I thought both drivers did a good job on race day. Fernando again, doing a super job in qualifying to make it into Q3, and yeah, Fernando, he feels like he's driving the best that he has been, and yeah, you could argue that he is. So, I'm just intrigued to see how Alpine get on in Hungary. Obviously, the scene last year where Esteban Ocon won his first Grand Prix of his career. So, intrigued to see how Alpine get on at Hungary the weekend. As for McLaren, and you know what, a good, not a bad weekend at all for McLaren. Yes, they're now behind, by only a small margin, the constructors to Alpine. I thought it actually wasn't a bad weekend for McLaren. Lando Norris, super job in qualifying to finish fifth. I think it was always going to be tough for him to keep George Russell behind. And I think Lando admitted himself that Alpine were just that little bit quicker at Paul Ricard at the weekend, but still more useful points for Lando Norris and McLaren as well, and also good to see Daniel Ricciardo as well. So good to see him. That's 2 points finishes on the trot now for the Australian. I'm hoping now that that's something that he can definitely build on going into Hungary, and then obviously you got the summer break. So at least if Daniel can achieve no points finish in Hungary, then at least he'll be going into the summer break with a bit more positivity. And yeah, no, as I say, Daniel wasn't, although he didn't make it into Q3, he was that little bit closer to Lando in qualifying, and because of the penalties to K-Mag and also to Carlos Sainz as well, that meant he was able to start the race in P9, and he wasn't quite able to hold off the threat of Esteban Ocon in the end. But yeah, still not a bad weekend at all for Daniel Ricciardo, and good to see him in the points once again. And then I have to say, also a shout out also to Lance Stroll as well, taking the final point for Aston Martin. So that's 4 10th place finishes for Lance Stroll this season. And, whilst obviously Max and also Lewis, perhaps George will take all the headlines, I thought Lance Stroll drove a good race. Was able to make his strategy work. Started, I think it was 15th that he started, able to make his way through the field, and then able to take that 10th place, that final point. Saw that close battle in the end with his teammate Sebastian Vettel. That could have got a little bit hairy, but thankfully in the end, it was able. Both Lance and Sebastian were able to finish. Seb just missing out on the points in 11th, but for Lance himself, yeah, really good point for him, and good drive from the Canadian, and something to definitely take into the weekend in Hungary. So yeah, not a bad race in France, and yeah, I'm one that I quite enjoyed. So for Formula One does head over to Hungary for the Hungarian Grand Prix, and I will be doing a preview for that. So if you want to talk things Formula One, I'm at Baggies20 on Twitter, and also Manish Patel 89 on Instagram, and I will catch up with you all when I do my preview for the Hungarian Grand Prix. Take care, everyone.